The desert did not care about reputation. It did not care about rank, about service records, about how many years a man had spent under fire. It offered heat without apology, silence without comfort, distance without end. And in that distance, in the shimmer of air above cracked earth, in the way light bent itself against nothing, it revealed exactly who a person was. Not who they said they were, who they actually were. Forward operating Base Kestrel sat at the edge of a dried riverbed in the valley's southeastern pocket. It was not impressive. A cluster of prefab shelters, comms equipment wrapped in thermal shrouding, 2 generator towers that groaned through the night like old men in pain, a perimeter of wire and sandbag, a flagpole that had lost its flag to a windstorm 3 weeks earlier and nobody had replaced it because nobody had time. Staff Sergeant Wade Collier stood outside the armory at 0630, coffee going cold in his hand, watching the supply truck offload its latest delivery, rations, medical kits, ammunition, and 1 new body. She came out last. Small, slim-shouldered, carrying her rifle case in one hand and a single duffel bag in the other. She moved without rushing, without the self-conscious rigidity of someone trying to prove something. She crossed the gravel clearing, found the shaded side of the armory wall, and set her bag down. Then she stood there, looking at the terrain beyond the wire. Not at the base. At the terrain. Collier watched her for a moment. Then he went back to his coffee. Her name was Specialist Nora Callahan, 24 years old. Attached to the unit as a secondary fire asset, the kind of assignment that came wrapped in language vague enough to mean almost anything. Support element. Flexible deployment. She had arrived with a transfer document that listed her previous posting as a training facility in the southwestern region, and a personal service record that was both unremarkable and oddly thin for someone her age. First Sergeant Dale Pruitt did not like thin records. He reviewed hers for approximately 4 minutes before setting it down, and deciding she was probably a mid-tier washout from some overambitious program that had chewed her up and sent her somewhere quieter to finish out her service. It happened. He had seen it before. Young soldiers who thought they wanted elite work and discovered too late that wanting and doing were different countries. She's yours, he told Sergeant Collier. 3rd bunk. Put her on equipment rotation. Collier assigned her the bunk. She took it without comment. The other members of Collier's section, Kowalski, Brennan, and Torres, were not welcoming. They were not hostile either, not exactly. But there was a particular kind of silence that formed around her in those first hours, the kind that comes from collective doubt. Kowalski, broad-shouldered and sunburned and enormously proud of his qualification scores, looked her over exactly once and returned to his equipment without speaking. Brennan made a joke to Torres that Collier didn't quite catch, but the direction of it was clear enough. Torres smiled. None of this was unusual. Callahan was new. Callahan was quiet. Callahan was half the body weight of anyone else on the section, and in places like this, the tendency was to assume that body weight mattered. What nobody paid attention to, in those first hours, was the way she used her eyes. She watched the wire lines. She watched the ridge formations to the northwest. She watched the way the wind crossed the open ground between the shelters, the way it shifted at the corner of the comms tower, the way it moved the dust in thin horizontal layers rather than vertical spirals. She watched all of this without appearing to watch anything. She sat on her bunk, stripped her rifle case open, laid each component on the canvas spread she'd unrolled beside her, and examined each piece with the focused patience of a watchmaker. "She's doing a full field strip," Torres said to Brennan, in a tone that made it sound like an accusation. "First day," Brennan said. "Field strip on the first day is either very good or very weird." Neither of them said which category they thought she fell into. She didn't look up. Collier came by at the end of the day and asked her if she needed anything orientation materials, base map, anything at all. She said no thank you. He noted that she had already memorized the base layout, the shift rotation schedule posted on the shelter wall, and the wind readings from the manual gauge mounted to the comms tower. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed. At night, she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling with the stillness of someone who had learned, a long time ago, how to rest without sleeping. The generators groaned. Kowalski snored. The desert breathed against the shelter walls. She did not speak. She did not explain herself. She did not try to make anyone comfortable with her presence. Silence is the first thing most people misread. They see quiet and assume empty. They see stillness and assume fear. They see someone who doesn't argue back, doesn't push, doesn't announce themselves, and they decide that person has nothing worth announcing. Nora Callahan was not afraid of what they decided. She had learned, across a sequence of experiences she did not discuss with anyone, that letting people be wrong about her was almost always more useful than correcting them. She recorded the afternoon wind readings in a small notebook, wrote the date, and went to sleep. The morning of the third day, Pruitt ordered a live fire qualification check. Standard procedure for any new attachment to the section. Every shooter qualified on their own, documented, filed. It was supposed to be routine. It became, briefly, theater. The range was a flat clearing 200 meters from the base perimeter, marked with steel targets at intervals. 100 meters, 300, 500. Distances that any competent field shooter could manage before breakfast. The sky was clear, and the sun was already grinding. Thermal currents would be rising off the ground by 0900. Collier noted the time and figured they'd be done well before it mattered. Callahan was the last to shoot. She set up without ceremony, laid flat, adjusted her position twice, settled the rifle into a natural mount. She looked downrange through the scope for a long moment, longer than most people look, longer than the situation called for, and then she fired. The round hit the dirt well left of the 100-meter target. Not close. Noticeably wide. Kowalski made a sound with his teeth. Brennan turned away, already done with the conversation. Torres looked at the target marker, then at Callahan, then at Collier, with an expression that said he had expected exactly this. Pruitt wrote something in his field clipboard that Collier couldn't read. Callahan did not move immediately. She stayed in her position. She adjusted something on the scope mount slowly, deliberately, and wrote 3 characters in her notebook. Then she stood up, cleared the rifle, and stepped back from the firing line. Nobody asked her what the 3 characters meant. Brennan said, later, to Torres. "She'll get someone killed," Torres said. "Or herself." Kowalski said nothing. He had a slightly different response than the others. Not kinder exactly, but more observational. He had been doing this long enough to know that a bad calibration shot could mean almost anything. He didn't say this to Brennan or Torres. He filed it somewhere private and went back to his work. Collier stood beside Callahan and waited for an explanation. She didn't offer one. "Do you want to try the 3-100?" he asked. "Not today," she said. "Pruitt is going to want to see better numbers before—" "He'll get them," she said. "No heat, no defensiveness, just a statement." Collier looked at her for a moment. At the scope she was uncapping, at the way her hands moved across the adjustment rings with the kind of practiced ease that only comes from 10,000 repetitions. At the notebook, which she was reviewing now, not her current notes, but earlier pages filled with entries he couldn't read from this angle. He left her alone. That afternoon, the thermal currents above the range surface bent the air into liquid columns. Callahan sat outside the shelter with her notebook and a handheld anemometer, a small, simple tool that measured wind speed and recorded readings every 7 minutes. She did not explain this to anyone. She did not ask for anyone's attention. By evening, she had cross-referenced her readings against the morning's deviation and made 4 additional notations. The 3 characters she'd written after the miss, they were not a record of failure. They were a record of the wind. The mission briefing came 2 days later. Reconnaissance of a valley corridor approximately 18 kilometers northeast, an area the intelligence section had flagged as a likely transit route for a significant hostile element. The goal was observation, documentation, and if necessary, disruption. 3 squads would deploy in staggered positions across the corridor's mouth. Alpha and Bravo would move into the lower ground. Charlie would hold the eastern ridge approach. Nora Callahan was assigned to the reserve element. This was not explained to her as punishment. It was simply the default position for any shooter who hadn't demonstrated field qualification to the section's satisfaction. Pruitt made this clear in approximately 2 sentences. She acknowledged it in 1. Kowalski and the others took positions in the forward element without discussing her assignment. There was no conversation about it. She simply wasn't in their operational picture yet, which meant she wasn't in their thinking either. She used the transit time to study the terrain. The valley corridor twisted northwest before opening into a wider basin. The walls were not sheer, they stepped, in geological layers, into broad shelves of cracked limestone. The shadows fell differently on the eastern face than the western, which meant the thermal differentials between the 2 walls would be significant by midday. She noted the way the scrub brush on the lower slope moved not with the wind direction she'd logged at the base, but slightly against it, which suggested a secondary flow pattern caused by the valley's shape. She told Sergeant Collier about the wind pattern. He was writing coordinates into his field radio. He said, She said the pattern suggested a lateral drift of approximately 8 to 12 degrees off her baseline at ranges above 1,500 meters. He said, "I'll keep that in mind." He did not keep it in mind. He was managing 3 squad movements simultaneously, and the intelligence about hostile numbers had just been revised upward, and he was trying to reach the forward observation post and his radio was intermittently cutting out. She stopped talking. She found her reserve position, a shelf of rock on the valley's southern wall, 40 meters above the corridor floor, with a sight line that extended northeast for approximately 3 kilometers before the terrain bent and closed. Not a perfect position, a usable one. She set her pack down and began mapping the environment in her notebook. Brennan walked past her at one point and said something under his breath to the soldier beside him. She didn't hear the exact words. She heard the tone. She wrote down the time and the wind speed and turned back to her scope. The squads moved into position. The desert settled into its midday silence. Nothing happened for 90 minutes. And then, with the completeness that only ambushes achieve, everything happened at once. The first burst of fire came from the northern ridge, not a single shooter, a line, 6, 7 positions opening simultaneously, interlocking fields of fire, positioned to catch Alpha and Bravo in the low ground below the corridor's central bend. The intelligence estimate had said 20 to 25 hostiles. The volume of incoming fire said otherwise. Alpha took cover behind the boulder field on the western side. Bravo had less luck. They were caught partially in the open. 2 soldiers down within the first 15 seconds, the rest scrambling for any depression in the ground deep enough to matter. Charlie, on the eastern approach, was pinned where they had stopped moving, unable to advance or withdraw without crossing open ground that was now comprehensively covered. 40 plus. Collier would count them later on the analysis footage. 40 plus, in pre-prepared positions, with a clear kill zone designed around exactly the approach the 3 squads had used. The comms went fragmented immediately. Collier tried to reach the forward radio relay. Static. He tried the base frequency. A broken signal. Too much interference. Too much noise. He had 3 squads under fire, declining ammunition on 2 elements, 2 personnel already down, and no close air support on station within useful range. He ran through options. There were not many options. Bravo's sergeant, a lanky, experienced man named Whitfield, was shouting into his handset and getting nothing back. The soldiers nearest him were maintaining suppressive fire into the northern ridge, but the range was long and the angle was bad, and they were burning through ammunition faster than the situation could justify. The hostile element had chosen their moment well. Midday sun at the backs of the attackers. Maximum thermal distortion for any shooter trying to acquire targets at distance. The wind pattern Callahan had noted, the lateral drift off the valley walls, would be carrying sound and dust in complex directions, degrading the squad's ability to locate the source of incoming fire. Everything was going wrong in the particular, surgical way that a well-planned ambush achieves when it catches good soldiers in bad ground. Collier did not think about the reserve element. Nobody thought about the reserve element. On her shelf of rock, 40 meters above and 600 meters south of the main engagement, Nora Callahan was already working. She had heard the first burst. She had been watching the northern ridge through her scope, not because she'd anticipated this exact scenario, but because it was the terrain feature with the most cover density at the ranges she had been cataloging, and habit directed her attention to places where threats could hide. When the line of fire opened, she was already looking in the right direction. She noted the positions. 7 primary firing points across approximately 200 meters of ridge. The nearest was at just under 2 kilometers. The farthest at roughly 2,800 meters, accounting for the lateral offset and the elevation drop. She did not radio Collier. She moved. Not fast. Fast was wrong here. Fast meant imprecision, instability, a disrupted baseline from which no accurate work could be done. She moved with the deliberate economy of someone for whom every wasted motion was a round that missed. She crossed 30 meters of shelf to the position she had identified in her terrain mapping, not when the ambush started, but 90 minutes ago, when she had first set up and begun reading the ground. She had already chosen this exact position. She had already calculated the approximate elevation offset to the ridge. She had already recorded the wind pattern. A soldier from Charlie Element, a young specialist named Garrett, caught halfway up the eastern approach, spotted her moving, and raised his hand in a gesture that was partly alarm and partly confusion. He didn't know if she was seeking cover or losing her mind. She met his eyes for exactly half a second. She lay down. The scope came to her eye the way it always came, not fitted, but found, the way a key finds a lock when both were made for each other. She controlled her breathing in 4 counts, not thinking about Bravo in the low ground, not thinking about the time running out, thinking about nothing except what was in front of the glass. The wind on the ridge was not the same wind that moved across the corridor floor below. The valley's shape was doing exactly what she'd mapped. The drift was running southeast to northwest at the ridge level, approximately 12 degrees off her earlier baseline. She'd predicted 8 to 12. She split the difference at 10. She set the adjustment. Garrett was still watching her. She did not look at him again. The crosshair settled. Her heart rate, if measured, would have shown something bordering on the medically unusual, not the heart of someone afraid, not the heart of someone performing, but something quieter and slower than either. The kind of steadiness that is not achieved through force of will but through years of replacing anxiety with information. She had the information. She took the first shot. The sound traveled slowly. Down the ridge wall, across the corridor floor, through the chaos of suppressive fire and shouted orders and the whip crack of incoming rounds, the report of her rifle arrived as one more noise in a field already saturated with noise. Nobody in Alpha or Bravo registered it specifically. Nobody in Charlie either, except Garrett, who watched the rifle kick and then watched the ridge. One figure dropped, not stumbled, not flinched. Dropped the instantaneous, boneless collapse that means the nervous system has simply stopped. The figure had been elevated slightly above the others, directing fire from the central position of the ridgeline. Then nothing. For 2 seconds, nothing. The incoming fire continued, the chaos continued. Then the rhythm of the incoming fire changed. Small change. Perceptible only to someone listening with the particular attention that comes from being shot at. The central position went quiet. The flanking positions continued, but their coordination shifted a hesitation, the way a flock of birds alters its shape when a single member changes direction. Second shot. The farthest position. 2,800 meters, cross-valley drift compounding the already significant drop calculation. Callahan adjusted, exhaled, fired. Another drop. The hesitation on the ridge became something more active movement, reorientation, the hostile element's defenders trying to locate the incoming fire, which meant they were looking south, which meant they were turning away from the squads below. Third shot. She was working right to left now, selecting for the figures who were standing, the ones giving direction, the ones whose absence would create the most disruption to coordinated movement. She was not shooting the most exposed targets. She was shooting the targets whose loss would cascade most damage through the hostile element's ability to function. This was not something she was calculating consciously. It was something she had practiced until it became a form of grammar. Collier heard the second or third report and turned, scanning southward from his position, trying to identify the source. He couldn't see her position. He could see the effects. The ridgeline behavior was wrong. The incoming fire was losing coherence. The coordinated spacing between the firing positions was degrading. He didn't know what was happening. He made a decision anyway. "Whitfield," he called into the radio. Static then, a voice. "Whitfield, I'm getting a change in their fire pattern. Get your element to your feet. Move west, now." In the corridor below, Sergeant Whitfield looked at the ridge, processed the changed rhythm of fire, and decided Collier was either right, or the situation couldn't get worse. He stood and moved, and his element moved with him. Fourth shot. Fifth. The rhythm was irregular, not random irregular. There is a difference. Random is chaotic. Irregular is deliberate. The hostile positions couldn't anticipate her next point of aim because the pattern was governed by priority assessment, not geometry. They couldn't establish where she would shoot next because the logic of it wasn't spatial, it was functional. She was disassembling a machine one critical component at a time. Sixth shot. A figure on the western end of the ridge, the one who had been directing the flanking fire onto Charlie's position, went down mid-movement. Charlie's sergeant, a compact woman named Reyes who had been pressed against a limestone shelf for 9 minutes, saw the flanking fire slow. She saw the opportunity. She didn't understand its source, and she didn't need to. "Move," she said to her element. They moved. Seventh. Eighth. The remaining hostile fighters on the ridge were no longer firing with any coherence. They were managing their own disorder, looking in multiple directions, trying to understand what was happening to them. A well-trained ambush had a specific shape. That shape required key components to function: command, coordination, fire discipline. Each of those components had a physical location. Each of those locations was now contributing nothing. The corridor below was still chaotic, but the vector of chaos had shifted. Alpha was moving, Bravo was moving, extracting its wounded. Charlie had reached the ridge approach and was climbing. Somewhere in the range of 50 seconds to a minute, nobody would be able to say exactly. Later, because nobody was watching the clock, the firing from the northern ridge became sporadic, then intermittent, then structurally collapsed. Not silent, but broken. The difference between organized fire and frightened men shooting without coordination is everything, and it is immediately perceptible to anyone who has ever been on the wrong end of both. Callahan fired her 9th shot. Then she stopped. She lay still for 4 seconds, scanning through the scope, reading the ridge for anything that required another round. Nothing did. She cleared the rifle. Steady hands. No shake in the aftermath, no tremor of adrenaline forcing its way out. Just the same hands that had set up the shot in the first place. Garrett was still watching her. He had counted. He had gotten to 8 before he lost track because he had been simultaneously trying to maintain his own position and not expose himself on the ridge approach, but he had counted at least 8. At ranges, his mind kept rejecting as possible. He didn't say anything. He stared at her hands, and he didn't say anything. It took 20 minutes for the 3 squads to regroup at the rally point south of the corridor. 2 personnel from Bravo had been hit, both alive. 1 serious, 1 manageable, no other casualties. Given the geometry of the ambush they had walked into, this was not just good fortune. This was a different outcome than the mathematics of the situation had initially suggested. Collier assembled his people. He counted them. Then he started counting explanations. The ridge fire broke, he said to Whitfield. I heard something from the south. Long intervals between shots. Whitfield said, someone was picking them off. Someone was picking them off from the south at better than 2 kilometers. Whitfield said nothing for a moment. Then, who have we got who does that? Collier looked at his section. She was there. She was sitting on a flat rock 20 meters from the main group, dismantling her rifle's scope mount for inspection. Methodical, no particular urgency. The same way she'd cleaned her equipment on the first day, while everyone watched her like a problem they hadn't yet decided how to solve. Kowalski looked at her. He looked at the scope in her hands. He looked at the ridgeline 3 kilometers to the north. Something moved across his face. Not quite recognition. Something more honest than recognition, the specific discomfort that comes from realizing you've been comprehensively wrong about something you were certain of. Brennan walked over to her. He stood there until she looked up. How many? He said. She looked at him for a moment. Flat, patient look. Enough, she said. He opened his mouth and closed it again. There was nothing particularly useful to say, so he didn't say it. Torres had been quiet since the regroup. He was sitting against a boulder with his helmet off, looking at the distance. He wasn't processing tactics, or the outcome, or the debrief that would be required. He was processing what it meant that he had said, 3 days ago, that she would get someone killed. He was processing the specific gap between what he had assumed and what had happened. The gap was significant. Callahan finished her inspection, reassembled the mount, and stood up. She slung the rifle. She looked at the northern ridge for a moment, not with any visible emotion, just looking. The way someone looks at a problem they've already solved and are now filing under resolved. Then she walked toward the rally point. Nobody made room for her. She didn't need them to. She found her own place and stood in it. Collier came to her last. He looked at her for a long moment. He was calculating something. She could tell by the stillness in his face that he was not performing assessment. He was actually doing it, running the numbers, trying to understand what he had just witnessed. The reserve position, he said. You'd already picked it out. It wasn't quite a question. 2 hours before the contact, she said. He nodded slowly. Then, the wind. What you told me this morning. It ran 10 degrees off my baseline at ridge level, she said. I'd estimated 8 to 12. So you'd already calculated for it. She didn't answer that. The answer was obvious enough that repeating it would have been unkind. He nodded again. Then he stepped back and didn't say anything else, because the things there were to say were not things that could be said quickly, and they needed to get the wounded back to base. That evening, Pruitt pulled the scope camera data. Every rifle in the section was equipped with a basic scope-mounted recording unit, a small device, no bigger than a cigarette lighter, that logged shot timing and direction. It was not high resolution, but it was enough. He sat at the field table with Collier and ran the numbers. 9 shots. Minimum distance to the nearest confirmed drop, 1,800 meters. Maximum, 2,900, accounting for the lateral geography and the elevation differential. Shot-to-shot interval, variable. Fastest interval was 4.2 seconds. Slowest was 11 seconds. Collier looked at the data for a long time without speaking. The 11-second interval, he said finally, between shots 6 and 7. She was doing what exactly? In those 11 seconds. Pruitt turned the datasheet over. He'd made a notation on the back. Wind shifted, he said. You can see it in the data from the valley sensor we had placed on the eastern approach. A 3-degree change at ridge level, right at that interval. She caught a wind change and adjusted in 11 seconds. Apparently. Collier put the datasheet down. Kowalski was in the doorway. He'd been there for most of the conversation. He hadn't been invited. But Pruitt had let him stay because Kowalski was the section's senior marksman, or had been until this afternoon, and his assessment was worth having. The calibration shot, Kowalski said. Pruitt looked at him. First day. She missed the 100-meter target. Everybody figured she couldn't shoot. He paused. She wasn't missing. She was testing the sight picture. The scope had drift in it. I saw her adjusting the mount after. She was checking how much drift against a known miss. Reading the equipment. Collier stared at him. A controlled miss, Kowalski said. She was collecting information. Nobody said anything for a moment. She told me about the wind pattern this morning, Collier said. I didn't listen. No, Pruitt said. She'd mapped the whole valley. Before we deployed. Before the briefing. She'd already picked her position before we even had the contact. Yes. The data sheet sat between them. 9 shots. 3 squads intact. 2 wounded. Neither critical. An ambush designed to destroy the forward element, a well-constructed, properly resourced, position-hardened ambush broken in under a minute by one shooter in a position nobody had assigned her to and working at ranges nobody had thought to account for. Pruitt folded the data sheet and put it away. She's not a reserve asset, he said. Collier said, no, she was never a reserve asset. He didn't say what she was. The category didn't have a comfortable name inside the standard organizational framework. Some things exceed the containers built for them, and the honest response is to acknowledge it rather than force a fit. In the shelter that evening, Kowalski walked to Callahan's bunk. She was reading her notebook. The same notebook, the one with the accumulated wind readings, the terrain notations, the 3 characters written after the calibration shot that now, in retrospect, he could interpret. He stood there. She didn't look up immediately. When she did, she looked at him the same way she looked at everything with the patient, comprehensive attention of someone who had already collected most of the relevant information and was simply waiting for the rest. He didn't apologize. He was not constitutionally suited to apology in the formal sense, but he said, "The controlled miss. That was good thinking." She looked at him. "I should have seen it," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to her notebook. That was all. It was enough. 3 weeks after the Valley, a signals officer named Marcus Webb, attached temporarily to Kestrel for a joint communications exercise, went through the unit's documentation and found Callahan's original training record, the real one, not the version in the transfer file. He brought it to Collier, who read it in his shelter at 2,200 with a single light source, and didn't put it down until he'd finished. The elite program that had trained her was not named in the document, but its metrics were: distance qualification, sustained accuracy at ranges that exceeded standard certification by a factor of 2.3, environmental adaptation testing, highest recorded score in her cohort, performance under observation. Third, highest score, performance without observation, highest. That last line stayed with him. Performance without observation, no audience, no evaluators watching, just the task and the environment and the shooter. She had scored highest when nobody was watching. He thought about that for a while. There had been, buried deeper in the document, a single adverse notation 2 years earlier. A joint operation in a different environment, colder, different ballistics, different terrain. She had taken a shot she'd assessed as viable. She had been wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, no friendly casualties, no mission failure, but wrong. The round had gone wide. The target had not been acquired. She had written a report afterward. Collier read it. It was the most technically precise, rigidly honest self-assessment he had ever read in a military document. It identified every decision point. It identified every variable she had weighted incorrectly. It identified the specific gaps in her environmental reading that had led to the wrong assessment. And then it described how she had addressed each gap. The next training record showed a 6-week period of intensive recalibration in exactly the conditions that had produced the miss. She hadn't just recovered. She had rebuilt every relevant skill set from the ground up, tested it against the failure point, and documented the result. She had trusted herself less after the failure, and because she had trusted herself less, she had worked harder. And because she had worked harder, by the time she arrived at Kestrel with her thin transfer file and her quiet manner and her controlled calibration miss, she was significantly more capable than the document was written to describe. Collier thought about her first morning on base, the way she had stood at the armory wall and looked at the terrain beyond the wire. Not at the base, not at the people, at the terrain. She had been working from the moment she arrived. He thought about the single adverse notation, the miss she'd turned into architecture. He thought about the way she hadn't argued when Pruitt put her in the reserve element, the way she hadn't complained when Kowalski and Brennan and Torres made their assessments, the way she had listened to him, not listened to her, that morning, when she described the wind pattern. She had let all of it happen. Not because she was passive. Not because she didn't know her own ability. But because she had learned, apparently, that the moment you use words to establish credibility, you have surrendered a particular kind of freedom. You become the person managing their reputation. You become the person defending their position. She was not interested in managing a reputation. She was interested in reading the wind. There was a name, in the program's documentation, for what she had consistently demonstrated. The document called it non-demonstrative competence, the deliberate choice to withhold performance evidence until performance itself was the only possible communication. Collier put the document down. He sat in the dark for a moment and thought about the 11-second pause between shots 6 and 7. The 3-degree wind shift she'd caught and adjusted for in real time, under fire, at ranges that made the adjustment nearly invisible to any external observer. He thought about what she had said when he'd asked her how many shots she'd fired. Enough. He put the document in his field safe and did not discuss it with Pruitt. He didn't think Pruitt needed it. He thought Pruitt already understood what the document described, in the same way that most things worth understanding are arrived at through direct experience rather than paperwork. He sat with it a little longer, though. There was something specific about the adverse notation that stayed with him. Not the miss itself, but the report she had written afterward. He'd read military self-assessments before. Most of them were exercises in careful language, designed to document fault without incurring too much of it, shaped by the knowledge that the document would be read by people who held authority over careers. They were honest in the technical sense of the word. Accurate, but hedged. Hers wasn't hedged. She had listed each decision point with the same neutrality she applied to terrain. Here is what I saw. Here is what I concluded. Here is why the conclusion was wrong. Here is what I failed to account for. Here is the gap between my model of the environment and the actual environment. And then, without apology, here is how I will close the gap. There was no self-pity in it. There was no performance of accountability, either the kind that says, look how honestly I'm examining myself. It was simply a technical document about a technical failure, produced by someone who had already decided that understanding the failure was more important than managing how the failure appeared. He thought about that distinction. Managing appearance was something most people did constantly, often without knowing it. It was almost automatic, the instinct to present the version of events that left the most favorable impression. Not lying usually, just selecting, emphasizing, framing. She had produced a document that contained no framing, just data, just analysis, just the map of exactly where she had been wrong and exactly what she intended to do about it. He understood, reading that, why she didn't argue back, why she didn't explain herself when Brennan made his jokes, or when Pruitt assigned her to reserve, or when Kowalski's certainty about her occupied the air like a declaration. She wasn't suppressing the urge to defend herself. She simply had no use for the exercise. Defense was about managing appearance. She was interested in something else entirely. She was interested in being better than she had been yesterday. Everything else was noise. He filed the document and turned off the light. The next morning, he moved her from the reserve roster. The new rotation came through 6 days later. A different corridor, longer distance, more complex terrain, 2 supporting squads and a forward observation element. The intelligence picture was better this time, cleaner, more verified, with actual source confirmation rather than estimates. The mission briefing ran 40 minutes. When it was done, Pruitt assigned positions. He assigned Callahan's first. Nobody commented on this. Nobody needed to. The assignment was not remarkable in the way that it would have been remarkable 2 weeks ago, when she was a person whose capabilities had not yet intersected with the understanding of the people around her. Now it was simply accurate. The most capable shooter in the section received the position that demanded the most from a shooter. This was how it was supposed to work. She looked at the terrain map for 4 minutes. She asked one question about the eastern ridge gradient, its specific angle, and when Pruitt gave her the measurement, she wrote it in her notebook and said nothing else. Brennan, sitting across the map table from her, watched her write. He was not the same as he had been. Not transformed, he was still fundamentally himself, still somewhat proud, still inclined toward quick assessment. But there was a calibration in him now, a small but genuine recalibration of what quick assessment was worth when the person being assessed hadn't yet had the opportunity to demonstrate what they were actually doing. Torres was quieter than he'd been before the valley, not troubled exactly, more careful. He had been genuinely certain about her capabilities and had been genuinely wrong, and he was the kind of person for whom genuine wrongness had lasting effects. He would be more careful now. Not paralyzed, more careful. Kowalski was different in a way that was harder to name. He had the highest qualification scores in the section, before the valley. He had worked hard for those scores. He was legitimately good and he knew it. And the knowledge had been not arrogance exactly, but a settled certainty that had functioned as a kind of floor beneath everything he did. The floor had not collapsed, but it had been repositioned. He understood now that there were different kinds of excellent. His kind, reliable, documented, consistently performed under observation was genuinely excellent. Her kind developed in private, tested against failure, expressed only when necessary, at distances that exceeded the framework most people thought in, was also genuinely excellent. These two kinds did not compete with each other. They existed in parallel, as different responses to the same underlying question of what it meant to be capable of something. He had thought about this more than he would have admitted. A week after the first mission, a new attachment came to Kestrel. 2 junior soldiers and a specialist from a different unit, temporarily assigned for cross-training, young, new to the environment. Carrying the particular combination of confidence and anxiety that marks people who haven't yet had their capabilities tested against real conditions. One of them, a young man named Porter, square-jawed, earnest, clearly trying to establish himself, asked Torres about the section on his second day. "Who's the best shooter?" Porter said. Torres looked at him. Then Torres looked in the direction of Callahan's bunk. She wasn't there. She was outside. She was always outside when the light was good enough to read terrain by. "Don't ask," Torres said. Porter frowned. "Why not?" Torres thought about how to explain it. He thought about the valley, about the 11 seconds between shots 6 and 7, about the controlled calibration miss that everyone had read as failure, and that had been, in fact, a data collection exercise. "Because what she is," Torres said, "isn't something you can explain to someone who hasn't seen it. And if you haven't seen it yet, the explanation won't make sense. And if you have seen it," he stopped, "you won't need to ask." Porter started to push for more. Torres went back to his equipment. That evening, Collier found Callahan at her established observation position on the north side of the base. She was lying flat, rifle mounted on its bipod, scope trained on the distant ridge formations. This was not a tasked observation. No one had asked her to do it. She was doing it because the light at this hour produced a specific quality of shadow on the limestone formations to the northeast, and that quality of shadow, read correctly, could tell you things about the subsurface drainage patterns that affected ground stability in ways that mattered when you were thinking about where a position might be placed. Collier sat down on the rock beside her position. The wind was moving. Not strong, a steady drift from the southeast, crossing the base at an angle that the weather gauge near the comms tower would have logged as unremarkable. She was logging it as something more specific than that. "Next rotation," Collier said. "I know," she said. "You're primary." "I know." He looked at the terrain she was watching. He tried to see what she saw in it. He couldn't quite get there. His eyes were good. His situational awareness was genuinely above average. But the specific translation from terrain observation to ballistic calculation to environmental factor integration required a kind of practiced fluency that he simply hadn't spent the hours to develop. He could appreciate it in the same way that someone can appreciate a piece of music played at a very high level without being able to play the instrument. "Back in training," he said. "Whoever was running your program." "We don't need to talk about that," she said. Not sharp, not a rebuke, just a closing. He let it close. They sat in silence for a moment. The desert held its particular evening light, amber and horizontal, throwing long shadows from every protrusion, every ridge, every element of the terrain that rose above the flat ground. Beautiful. In the way that things with danger in them are often beautiful. "The 9 shots," Collier said. She didn't respond. "I've been trying to understand the sequence. Why those targets? In that order." She was quiet for a moment, still watching through the scope, not at anything specific, just maintaining the habit of watching. "Command first," she said. "Then the coordinators. Then the ones feeding information to positions they'd already lost. You were collapsing the decision structure. Not just that." She shifted slightly, a micro-adjustment to her position that had nothing to do with any current target, just maintenance of form. The other positions needed someone telling them what to do. Once that was gone, they had 2 choices: fight without coordination or try to figure out the situation. Either way, they were working on a problem that wasn't the 3 squads below them. You gave the squads time. I gave them a different problem. He thought about this. The 11 seconds between 6 and 7. She didn't answer immediately. "Wind changed," she said. 3 degrees. 2.8. He almost smiled. He caught it and didn't. The evening settled around them. The generators at the base began their cycle. Somewhere behind them, the sounds of the section going through its evening routine: food, maintenance, the particular noise of tired people occupying a small space. She was still watching the ridge. Finger still, not waiting for anything specific. Watching the way someone watches who has learned that readiness is not a posture but a condition. Not something you put on when the situation demands it, but something you maintain because the gap between a threat developing and a threat arriving is almost never as long as people believe. She had learned this in the valley. She had learned it before the valley, in the program, in the training cycles, in the 6 weeks of deliberate recalibration after the miss. She had learned it in the specific way that things learned through failure are learned not as information but as structure, embedded below the level of conscious decision, available without retrieval, because it had become the shape of how she thought. Collier stood up eventually. "Good night," he said. She said, "Wind's holding southeast tonight. You'll want to have Brennan's element shift their perimeter coverage 15 degrees clockwise if you're putting them on the north watch." He stopped. He stood still for a moment. "The secondary entrance corridor," she added. "The thermal differential at the valley mouth pulls the ambient temperature gradient eastward after 2200. If anyone's using that approach in the dark, they'll hug the eastern wall. Brennan's current watch arc doesn't cover it." He looked at her. She was still watching the ridge. Still. "I'll tell him," Collier said. He walked back toward the base. She stayed. The scope held the terrain at 3 kilometers. The light was going but not gone. The shadows were lengthening across the limestone shelf she'd been studying. And in their lengthening she could see exactly what she'd expected to see, the drainage channel she'd hypothesized, there in the shadow's edge, running northeast to southwest, exactly where the subsurface pattern suggested it would be. She wrote it in her notebook. The wind held steady. Her fingers did not move. Out there, in the amber distance, the desert was doing what it always did, refusing to be summarized, refusing to be finished, offering itself in infinite particular detail to anyone patient enough to look. She looked. She was always looking. That was the only thing they had ever truly misunderstood about her. They had seen quiet and read weakness. They had seen stillness and read absence. They had seen someone who didn't announce herself and decided she had nothing worth announcing. But there is a specific kind of error that competent people make when they evaluate others. It is the error of assuming that visible effort is the only real kind. That confidence, worn on the surface, is the only proof of something underneath, that a person who does not perform their capability must not have any. It is an easy error. Almost everyone makes it. The world rewards the announced thing, the stated thing, the thing that fills a room with its own importance. The quiet thing gets sorted to the reserve roster. What they had not accounted for, what the assessment framework of a forward operating base, with its qualification scores and its calibration shots and its visible markers of worth, had no mechanism to measure, was the quality of a mind that had spent years turning its attention outward. Not inward at reputation, not inward at how it was being perceived, but outward at the world, at the terrain, at the wind, at the specific angle of shadow on a limestone shelf at this hour, in this light, from this position. She had pointed all of that attention at becoming exactly what the situation required, not at being recognized for it. Kowalski had it right. In the end, though he'd arrived at it sideways, there were different kinds of excellent, and the kind that operated without an audience, that measured itself against the miss, against the gap between model and reality, against the wind shift caught in 11 seconds with 9 lives depending on the adjustment, was not a lesser kind. It was just quieter. Silence is not empty. Sometimes it is the fullest thing in the room. Sometimes the person who says least has already seen the most, mapped the approach, measured the wind, chosen the position, and is simply waiting with the complete patience of someone who has learned that the right